Don Lines was the high school Sunday school teacher at the Gahanna Community Church in the 1960s. He made learning interesting and fun. One year, he encouraged his class on the first day of the year as a New Year's resolution to commit themselves to reading a single chapter from the book of Proverbs a day during the month of July. Now, a chapter in Proverbs is less than a typed page by comparison. To give you some idea, that was a manageable task even for an attention deficit kid like me. And so it was. There are 31 days in January and 31 chapters in the book of Proverbs. By the end of January, I had read through my first book of the Bible. And you can see where that led. Don's wife, Elsie, was the treasurer of the church forever. I think it was a lifetime title for her. All of their kids went to church camp, and the whole family was engaged in the ministry of that local congregation, which is interesting because Don Lines never joined the church. Don wasn't a joiner. He was one of those cussedly independent kind of guys. And he figured, well, if I can teach Sunday school and if my wife can be involved and my kids participate in the ministry, what's the point? And he was just that kind of guy. And in the community church, that wasn't required for them to serve. And I'm bringing him to mind because today is Community Church Sunday, when we celebrate our heritage and the distinctives of our faith tradition. We're a church like most every other church, but there are some distinctives about community churches. And it's kind of ironic that we're picking a non-member like Don Lines to help us understand one of the distinctives of the community church. I referred to him just a moment ago as being cussedly independent. That's the title of our message. The word cussedly here means mulish or pig-headed, stubborn, obstinate, obdurate, that kind of thing. That's the kind of guy Don Lines was. They have always been parts of the church universal and always will be, and we're going to find out why in our message for today. In fact, we're going to go through history a little bit. We're going to begin with Martin Luther right here. We're going to go back and forward a little bit to see how the cussedly independent types have been expressed in the life of the church. Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a Catholic priest. He got this whole denominational business started, by the way. He was a cussedly independent guy. There were things about the church he saw that he did not like. The selling of indulgences or forgiveness, for example. If you had enough money, you could be forgiven. It was sort of like a privilege that the overprivileged could afford. Underprivileged, not so much. Martin Luther's looking at this. Of course, the money went to the church and its leaders, a little self-serving. And he couldn't find anywhere in scriptures where that was located. And so he protested against the practice. That's where the word Protestant comes from, protesting things. And he protested not only that practice, but the church in general and its leader, the Pope. Now, that could get you killed in that day and age. But Martin Luther, he didn't care. He was one of those pig-headed, cussedly independent types that come into the church. And so were some of the other religious reformers of his day. John Calvin, Menno Simons, and Jacob Ammon, the Anabaptist tradition, and Ulrich Zwingli. They were all cussedly independent types. And their ilk goes beyond church history. To Jesus Christ himself we will see, and before him even, to the prophets and the judges before them. In fact, that statement at the top of our bulletin is kind of instructive. It is about the judges and the Old Testament prophets. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. But let's get back to Jesus, who is the focus of our text for today. Just after his introduction to the world by John the Baptist, he sets off making a big splash, healing the sick, and drawing multitudes to him through the power of his words. And he comes to the point to where he now is preaching his first sermon that we traditionally know as a Sermon on the Mount. And after a very thought-provoking introduction that we know as the Beatitudes, he gets down to business, which is where our text begins. He says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets." Now, why would anyone think that? First off, the law and the prophets is how they referred to their Bible, the sacred scriptures. You will recall at that time there was as yet no New Testament. So what we call the Old Testament was referred to by them as the law and the prophets. Back to the question, why would anybody think that Jesus was out to destroy the sacred scriptures of his faith tradition? The answer is that he dared to interpret them differently. Differently than who? Well, differently than the religious leaders of his day, the priests, the scribes, the teachers of the law, the religious parties, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and so forth. They were going to tell the people what the sacred scriptures meant. It reminds me of medieval Europe, when the scriptures were translated into a language nobody could understand, which was Latin, except for the priests who were trained in Latin, literally chained to the pulpit. You couldn't check it out of the library. In fact, when the first guy developed a new technology called the printing press and printed it into the vernacular of the people, I don't know, he was burned at the stake, beheaded, something. They killed him for that crime, because the religious authorities will tell you what it says in there, you see. And that's what was going on in Jesus' day. They determined what the scripture said, but Jesus had his own unique interpretations. And in our text today, we find a prelude to 6 illustrations that follow after it that all begin with the same words. You have heard that it was said. You have heard by whom? You have heard by the religious authorities. The priests and so forth. They determine what it says. Now, unfortunately, that religious establishment tends to complicate things. It's one way that we can control things. We can control your giving to the central government by our tax code, for example. Very complicated. And they complicated the religious, they took the original 10 Commandments in the Mosaic Code, and they added to that 248 additional commandments, 365 prohibitions, one a day, and 1,521 amendments. In short, they take a very legalistic approach to the scriptures, to spirituality. Now, the problem with taking a legalistic approach is that people tend to substitute the letter of the law for the spirit of the law. Jesus comes back to restore the original purity, the spirit of the law. He says, "You have heard that it was said to the people, 'Do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment.' Again, 'You have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart.'" Now, I'm a guy. I know how we talk. It doesn't hurt to look. Doesn't hurt you. It's be interesting when that is turned around the shoes put on the other foot. And when your wife looks lustfully at another guy, like your brother or your best friend, that doesn't feel too good, does it? It hurts. Jesus expands beyond the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. In all of these 6 illustrations, they all begin, "You have heard that it was said, but I tell you." He always pushes beyond the letter of the law to the spirit. Well, this really upsets the religious leaders of his day, who end up doing to him what Pope Leo X did to Martin Luther, that cussedly independent Martin Luther. First, he defrocks him as a priest. Then he excommunicates him from the faith altogether. Then he declares him a heretic. And then he issues a proclamation that frees anyone in that world to kill him. It reminds me of the modern author Salman Rushdie. A fatwa was put out on him by Ayatollah somebody that permitted any Muslim to kill him because of he insulted the Prophet, I guess, in his writing, according to that guy. That's what they did to Martin Luther. Now let's move back. Let's move, or I guess it would be up, to early 1600s England. King James is on the throne. One of the things he does is he commissions a Bible, a new translation of the Bible, called the King James Version. In your pews, we have the New King James Version of the Bible. You would never have found a King James Version of the Bible, by the way, in an early congregational church in America, and I'll tell you why. It was peopled by members who were, we call them pilgrims. They were on a spiritual pilgrimage, but they were originally known as separatists. In England, they separated themselves from the Church of England because of perceived corruption that had entered into the church. There were others who sought to purify the church from within. They were known as Puritans. But there were others who were just that cussedly independent type and decided to separate from the church altogether. Bad idea. Big no-no. The Church of England was a state church. That means it was the only church in the country that by law could exist. In fact, everybody had to be a member of it. When a new baby was born, the rolls automatically went up by one. King James was the titular head of the Church of England. He didn't like this idea of people separating from the church. He regarded such people as traitors. He had this to say about them: I will make them conform themselves, or else I will harry them out of the land, or else do worse. Now, to harry someone meant to persistently harass them, and he did harass them until they left the land. First they went to Leiden in Holland. That didn't work out too well. Then they got on a ship to go to the new land called Speedwell. It was neither speedy nor well. Had to come back and make some repairs. And they transferred to another ship called the Mayflower. And again, we know them as pilgrims. They were on a spiritual pilgrimage. They came to this land for the purpose of seeking religious freedom. But they were separatists in their homeland. And when they got here, they set about creating their own churches. I guarantee you they were not Church of England churches. In fact, they intentionally made the churches they established a contrast to what they had left behind. In contrast to the ornate edifices of the corrupt Church of England, they built plain meeting houses. That's what they called them. Plain meeting houses. There was no king as a titular head. There were no bishops. There was no diocese. No denominational trappings at all. The congregation owned the meeting house, called the pastor. The congregation charted their course. And that is why they became known as Congregationalists. Each church was an independent, autonomous local congregation. They were cussedly independent types. Now, they cooperated with each other on things of mutual importance to them. For example, spreading the faith. The country was expanding westward. And as it did, the Connecticut Missionary Society developed to establish new congregational churches in the western wilderness areas. Well, this area was once a wilderness area, the western outpost of civilization, and the Connecticut Missionary Society came here and started a new congregational church in Aurora, Ohio. Originally, it was called the Congregational Church in Aurora. I think some cussedly independent members said, we'll just call it the Church in Aurora, thank you. The statement on the front of most every church bulletin here is a vestige of our founding principles. It is classically congregational, allow me. Tell me this doesn't sound like some cussedly independent type writing this. The government of this church is vested in its members, and it shall be subject to no denominational body in its faith or practice, except that it shall strive to cooperate with all religious bodies and to share their common aims and works. We may be cussedly independent, but as long as people aren't harassing us about it, we're a pretty friendly bunch, actually. Very cooperative type of people. The members of this church shall have the undisturbed right to follow the Word of God according to the dictates of their own consciences. You will not find that statement on the front of a bulletin in any other church on this road, and there are a lot of them. They should have named it Church Street. You won't find that statement anywhere else because it is a distinctive of congregationally governed churches like member churches of the International Council of Community Churches. An independent, cussedly independent branch will always be a part of the church, has always been a part of the church universal. Why? Because churches are human institutions, and corruption will find a way to enter in from time to time, and you need somebody to hold it accountable and somebody to offer an alternative to that sorry state. And that's why there will always be cussedly independent types. Always been around the church, always will be. And if that resonates with you today, if you would like to further that, part of the church that's always been there, that was in Jesus, in the prophets, in the judges, in the early church, the reformers of the Protestant Reformation, if that resonates with you and you'd like to support it, let me suggest that you locate the envelope in your pew rack that has a green border. That's for a special offering. And I want to encourage you to put a few bucks in it and drop it in the offering plate today. Now, I'm asking you to do it. I'm not telling you. I know better than that. But I hope that you will decide in your heart to give to that. And here's what you can expect. Brother Bob Harris, our local ecumenist, will ensure that one half of it goes to the Ohio Fellowship of Community Churches, because he's the president currently. He'll see that that happens. He'll see that one half goes to support the good work of the International Council of Community Churches. Not a denomination, just a fellowship of like-minded congregations that meets annually. In fact, if you'd be interested in going to their annual conference, this year it's going to be in Louisville, Kentucky, also known as Louisville. And Brother Bob and I are going to go as voting delegates. But if you would like to go, I'd gladly relinquish that role for you to attend the business meeting while I sit in the lounge having coffee with my friends that meet there. I love going to the conference. Is a lot of fun this year in Louisville, not too far away. If you'd be interested in that, we have funds available to help make that possible for you because of your generosity in part. But we get together, we put our heads together, and we cooperate as we are able to while we preserve that cussedly independent part of our nature. Well, I want you to do it because you've decided in your heart to give, not because you've been browbeat into doing that. I want you to decide on your own to follow Jesus. That's the hymn we're going to sing. I've decided to follow Jesus. I invite you to rise now as we testify to that together.